Welcome everybody to yet another chapter of this ongoing series on a harmony of interests, looking at different aspects of the American system as an international phenomenon, and not just in the 18th century as something that just happened in one continent of the world, but is something which has expressed a yearning of civilization to move beyond categories of organization that define mankind as some form of talking animal to be controlled by an alpha class, a master class. And this is something that, as we've seen in the course of the last several months of our weekly lectures, has gone back to the fight of the Pythagoreans, the schools of Plato and his academy, the networks of Cicero, of Augustine, the reemergence of Platonic Christianity with Augustine's fight, and the networks that he deployed around the world, or around Europe, especially in Ireland, around St. Patrick, which will hopefully be the topic of a future class, all the way through the explosion of the 15th century Golden Renaissance in Florence. In this current series, we've been exploring different aspects of how this process moved across the ocean into the Americas, starting with the 1630 deployments of people like John Winthrop, Increase Mather, and that whole Puritan movement. But it wasn't Puritan, it was something even more than that. It was just that was the particular garb that it took at that moment, but it goes into something much more universal. So today, we are going to be treated to a series of discoveries that a good friend, Gerald Therrien, has made over many years. I myself had the pleasure of first being introduced to Jerry back in 2006, and it was Jerry who, I must say, was the first to introduce me to the method of universal history, and especially seeing Canada, learning how to see Canada within the context of a higher universal struggle and context. I hadn't really encountered that before until Jerry started giving me a few personal lectures, and that was really an eye-opening experience. So in the past few years, especially since 2015, we've had the pleasure of publishing a lot of Jerry's works and writings and essays on the Canadian Patriots site. Just last week, his first volume of a 4-volume series, possibly soon 5-volume series on Canadian history, going back to the pre-revolutionary period, was just made a paperback and a Kindle, which people can access on Amazon. Jerry today is going to tackle one small but very interesting chapter of world history, which I'm very much looking forward to. So Jerry, I'm going to make you host, and the show will be entirely yours.
Oh, wow. Okay.
All right, your host.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to mute everybody, but then if you want to unmute yourself, go right ahead, but that way there won't be any distraction. Okay. And this is my latest project that Matt just put up on the Canadian Patriots site. It's called Ireland, Haiti, and Louisiana. So I don't want to do the whole thing or I'll be here for like 2 weeks. So I just want to I'm trying to keep it down to a couple hours and just focus in on the revolution in Haiti, which was started in 1791 and basically until 1804. So it's kind of like 15 years. And so I just want to cover that as quickly as I can, and how that affects Canada, how Canada is influenced by this. So there's a lot of interesting things I discovered in it, and there's a lot of crap I had to wade through to find it out, you know. It's like my father used to say, sometimes you got to put your hand in a bucket of shit to try to find a diamond. And that's what this was like. So let me get to my slideshow here. There. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. This is on Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution and the effect on Canada, and also the effect on United States. I'm going to cover that. This will be at the end, so I hope you don't fall asleep by then. So to look at Haiti, we have to go back to Columbus. And the first attempted colonies in the New World by Columbus were actually on the island of Haiti. He called it La Isla Española, and then they Latinized it to Hispaniola. That's what it's called. When Columbus made his voyages, the enslavement of native people was not allowed. But Spain's feudal labor system that was imposed on the natives, and later the spread of disease, especially smallpox, disastrously reduced the native population. And you can't blame Columbus for this. I mean, he worked for the King and Queen of Spain. They made policy. But since slavery was legal in Spain, slaves in Spain could be brought to the Spanish colony as slaves. They couldn't be brought directly from Africa, but if you owned slaves in Spain, you could bring them to Haiti. And you can't blame Columbus for that because that's the law of Spain. In 1518, the Spanish Empire, under the Habsburg King Charles I, who became the Holy Roman Emperor, he allowed enslaved Africans to be directly imported to the Spanish colonies to work in the mines and on the sugar plantations because the native population was dying off. And this is basically when the African slave trade really began to expand after that period. You can't blame that on Columbus either because he died in 1506. So this is 12 years after his death. I just say all this because there's these people running around trying to pull down statues of Columbus, and I think they're massively misinformed, especially that mayor in Chicago. And the best thing to do is to read a book on the life of Columbus by Washington Irving, and you really get a sense of this guy. And don't read this book by Howard Zinn. He's a complete fraudster. And that's where a lot of this anti-Columbus stuff comes from. So now I just want to look at what the world was like when the revolution in Haiti started in 1791. Okay, Saint-Domingue, Haiti in 1791. Now the western end of the island of Haiti, by then the Spanish were calling it Santo Domingo, it began to be colonized by France in about 1664, and the French called it Saint-Domingue. Now, slavery was allowed in the French colonies by the Traité de Noir, which was issued by Louis XIII in 1642. So that's when the French started getting into the slave trade around there. The British were a little before. They had the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company doing it. But that's when the French did it. In 1791, the French colonies in the West Indies were the islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, Tobago, Saint Lucia, and Saint-Domingue. But the most important colony economically was by far Saint-Domingue, with its 398 cotton and indigo plantations, its 1,962 coffee plantations, and its 655 sugar plantations, which contributed 2/3 of France's tropical produce and 1/3 of its foreign trade. So this was like their goose that laid the golden egg, all on slave labor, mind you. Now, the majority of the plantation owners were called Grand Blanc, big whites, and they lived on their plantation. A minority of them lived in France, but the majority lived there in Saint-Domingue. And there was a middle class of merchants and shopkeepers and lower class of plantation overseas artisans and mechanics that were called petits blancs, the little whites. Together, the big whites and the little whites made up about 35,000 of the colony's inhabitants. Then there was also the mulattoes, which is a horrible name. People shouldn't use that. It's like Métis in Canada, where usually the father was, Spanish and the mother was African. Anyway, their children and some free blacks together were called gens de couleur. And they owned about 1/3 of the plantations and about 1/4 of the slaves in the colony. But they had to face social and racial discrimination, and they were not allowed to hold any public office, any public trust or employment. And they made up about 25,000 of the inhabitants, a little less than the big whites and little whites. But the overwhelming majority of the inhabitants in the colony were the almost 500,000 enslaved Africans who labored on the plantation. And over 2% of the slaves died each other. Some people say it was 5%, but you basically had to import between 10 and 20,000 slaves from Africa every year just to replace the ones that you worked to death, let alone, to open up new plantations. So that was life in Saint-Domingue in 1791. Now, the United States. This is interesting. United States in 1791. By 1791, except for Georgia, which came a little later, all of the American states and territories had either abolished slavery or had banned the importation of slaves. The United States of America was the leading nation in the entire world in the cause of ending slavery and the slave trade. I just want to repeat that because no one seems to admit this. But the United States of America was the leading nation in the world in the cause of ending slavery and the slave trade in 1791. Of course, people say, what happened, between then and the Civil War, but I'm not going to go there. We have to wait for Anton Chaikin's book to come out, and you'll see what happened. So slavery was abolished in Rhode Island in 1774, in Vermont in 1777, Pennsylvania 1780, Massachusetts 1781, New Hampshire 1783, Connecticut 1784, and the Northwest Territory 1787. The Northwest Territory we call it the Ohio country. Everything north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. It used to be part of Virginia Territory, but they basically donated it to the Union and agreed, along with everyone, that there would be no slavery allowed in the Northwest Territory, so that when any states are formed out of this territory later, there would be no slavery there. Now, the slave importation was banned in Delaware, 1776, Virginia, 1778, Maryland, 1783, New Jersey, 1786, North Carolina, 1786, South Carolina, 1787, New York, 1788, and Georgia in 1793. So by 93, every state and territory had done one of the others. Now, the slave importation is a mixed thing. Some people who were against slavery, who couldn't get slavery banned, were in favor of at least banning the importation of it. There was other people, particularly in Virginia, that had a surplus of slaves. So they wanted to ban the importation of slaves so that they would be able to sell their slaves to the other states, at a higher price. So the importation ban is kind of a mixed thing. So now let's look at Canada in 1791. Now, Canada, of course, was affected by the Tory refugees and militia troops that were sent to Canada between 1776 and 1783 when the American Revolution ended. Here we're taught to say they were loyalists, but Americans get to call them Tories. So in Nova Scotia, 30,000 Tories and troops, which included 1,200 slaves and 3,000 free blacks, were sent to Nova Scotia. But 2/3 of all the free blacks were denied land grants or food, which they had been promised. And they were forced into being an indentured servant, and they were exploited as cheap labor. In January of 1792, almost 1,200 of these free blacks elected to leave Nova Scotia and relocate to Sierra Leone in Africa. Now, in Upper Canada, that's Ontario, 10,000 Tories and troops, including 500 slaves, came to Ontario. Some of them simply relocated from Nova Scotia and Lower Canada because they were giving out free land in Upper Canada, so went there instead. In Lower Canada, in Quebec, 6,000 Tories and troops, including 130 slaves, went to Quebec. Most of them began arriving as early as 1776 from northern New York State. When the Revolution broke out and the fighting started, a lot of the settlers in the north had to flee from the, revolutionary troops, and they just went right up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River and settled where the British forts were along there. Now here's something interesting. Since the census of 1784 in Lower Canada listed 304 slaves total, so if you subtract the 130 slaves that the Tories brought, it's estimated that before the Tories arrived, there were 174 slaves in all of Lower Canada, Quebec. African and mostly indigenous slaves. About 2/3 of all the slaves in Canada were natives, indigenous people. A lot of the French fur traders would go west to trade for furs, and sometimes they would trade for slaves and bring them back. The African slaves were harder and more expensive to get. It's horrible to say, but most of the African slaves were, to prove that you had money, and they were servants in your house. No slave ship ever came to Quebec. So if you wanted an African slave, you had to go to the slave markets in the States or somewhere else. Now, so there was 174 slaves in all of Quebec before the Tories came. Now, Thomas Jefferson owned more slaves than all of French Canada. He had 200 of them. So it kind of puts it in perspective. And if you were a slave in Canada and you escaped, you would, of course, flee to the United States, where slavery had been abolished. Kind of what we think of as the Underground Railroad, but it actually started the other way. So next slide. In 1793, during the first elected assembly in both Canadas, they finally got assemblies. In January, a Lower Canada bill to stop the importation of slaves was introduced but not passed. In Upper Canada, in June, a bill to stop the importation of slaves was passed. So we're on the anti-slavery meter. We're tied with Georgia, right in there. Now, when the Legislative Council in Canada was holding hearings, 1787, because the people living in Quebec wanted to have a legislative assembly finally, and they were presenting petitions to the Legislative Council. There was also this interesting address they inserted, a prohibition to the bringing of slaves into the country. Slavery being alike contrary to the principles of humanity and to the spirit of the British Constitution. This committee recommends that means be adopted to prevent the bringing of slaves into the province in the future. But as to the few Negro or Indian slaves who are already in servitude, they conceive that they ought not in justice or policy to be emancipated. So they didn't really want to free the slaves, but they did want to stop the importation. To many families, there are of them valuable as property and servants, and we have frequently seen instances of slaves being manumitted, soon becoming idle and disorderly, and finally a burden to the public. Now, if there's only 170 slaves in all of Quebec, how many of these are actually freed a year? Maybe one? And this one guy is becoming idle and disorderly and a burden to the public? I think this last part got written by someone who actually owns slaves and was just sticking that in there to, give his excuse. And it goes, we further recommend that after so many years, all infants who shall be born of parents who are slaves be declared free. This is what they call gradual emancipation. And this, even though it was introduced in Montreal in 1787, it's almost word for word the bill that was passed in Ontario in 1793 and the one they tried to pass in Lower Canada in January but failed to. So, next slide. Okay. Oh, hang on, I think I missed one. Sorry. Nope. Now, Britain in 1791. The abolition movement in England was started by a man named Granville Sharp. Fascinating guy. I'd like to talk more about him, but I can't. Anyway, he was a good friend and collaborator of Dr. Benjamin Franklin while he was over there. So you could say Dr. Franklin helped start the abolitionist movement. Now, for the British, even after Yorktown, at the end of the Revolutionary War, they were still trying to mobilize African slave troops, urging slaves to, flee the plantation and come over behind the British lines. But it wasn't because they were, anti-slavery. They were using this as part of economic warfare against the United States. Now, after the end of the war, 1783, when the British finally pulled out of the United States, they had 3 ports they were still in. In Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, many of the former slaves were sent to Florida or Jamaica, and many of these were captured and resold back into slavery. Many of the former slaves in New York State, who were granted their freedom for wartime services, they actually fought in black regiments for the British Army. These are the ones who were shipped to Nova Scotia. Now, in 1791, the work of Granville Sharp and his collaborators, the British House of Commons, they introduced a bill to abolish the importation of slaves to the colonies, not into England, to the colonies. But it was voted down almost 2-1. So Britain's actually behind Georgia on the anti-slavery meter. In 1791, Britain at that time was at war with France. The British government passed the Seditious Meetings Act and the Treasonable and Seditious Practicing Act that targeted abolitionists and also other reformers, people who were trying to get the right to vote, which paralyzed and suppressed any of their organizing, petitioning, or meetings. So the abolition movement was shut down at that point. And also that year, 1793, the British invaded Saint-Domingue to try to put down the slave revolt because they wanted to stop the rebellion from spreading to their slave plantations in Jamaica and their other colonies. So it shows you that slavery in England was viewed differently than slavery in the British colonies. And I just show this point, 1793, the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, Simcoe, he signed into law the bill against slave importation into Upper Canada. In 1797, he was sent as commander-in-chief to fight Toussaint Louverture and the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue. And when I was first doing work on this, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I sent some of this to Pierre Baudry to say, isn't this kind of contradictory? Is Simcoe for slavery or is he against it? And he sent back an email saying it's not contradictory. You have to pay attention to the intention. Why were they doing this? And then you start figuring the whole thing out. So now there's the island of, well, Hispaniola. On the right, this is the Spanish part, Saint-Domingue. And this is the French part called Saint-Domingue. Now on August 22nd, 1791, right here, slave rebellion started here near the capital, Cap Français. This is the North Province. 100,000 slaves revolted in the North Province of Saint-Domingue, led by a man named Boukman. Now, it's hard to find anything out about this guy, but Boukman had been a slave in Jamaica and had been called Bookman because he had taught himself to read and write. But after he tried to teach other slaves how to read and write, he was sold by his British owner to a French plantation owner in Saint-Domingue, and his name, instead of Bookman, became Boukman. French accent, I guess. Now, at one of their regular night meetings on August 14th, the assembled slaves swore an oath to break their chains or die. And a week later, the revolt began. In the South Province and the West Province, the gens de couleur revolted, and they were joined by the slaves there too. And I just asked myself, how was this organized? I mean, 100,000 people revolted at once. How do you do this? And there's nothing about it. They don't write about how this was done. You know, some guy writes about the socio-economic blah, 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 and some other guy writes about the anthropological blah, 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 and someone says, oh, I read your blah, blah, blah. It was very good. Now, here's your PhD. You're a doctor of blah, blah, blah. And this is the garbage you have to sift through. But my understanding is, you know, if you've ever tried to organize other people to come to a meeting or do petitioning or hand out literature or something, you know, it's a lot of work, and you get a few people. 100,000. This is what they don't want to admit. He must have his network of organizers, and they had theirs, and somehow they had these meetings. By the next day or two, it had spread to every plantation of the North. And all I can think is this guy Boukman, he must have been the greatest organizer of all time. 100,000 people. And they had no weapons. You grabbed a stick or whatever farm implement you could steal. But you had to have, it wasn't just because, oh, I'm a slave, I'm not going to live long here anyway, what have I got to lose? No. They actually had a higher purpose. They had a higher intention on it. Now, when the slave revolt broke out in France, the National Legislative Assembly, which was the new government in France after they adopted the Constitution, what they did was grant full citizenship to the gens de couleur. Now, there was an anti-slavery society in France at the time, Société des Amis Noirs, that Lafayette was part of and had been organizing. Now, you could say, well, I guess this was the best they could get, but remember, by August of that year, Lafayette had to flee the country or they would have chopped his head off, along with the other leadership. So really, they granted citizenship to the gens de couleur simply to gain their support against the slaves, figuring, you know, if the gens de couleur, instead of allying with the slaves and fighting the big whites and little whites, would ally with them against the slaves, we might be able to turn this thing around. So the intention of the French government was not good. They also sent 3 peace commissioners and 7,000 troops to Saint-Domingue. So that shows you what their intention really was. When they got there, the commissioners decreed the protection of slavery and the recognition of full citizenship for all the gens de couleur. And the insurgents were badly beaten by the French troops, and they were driven inland and into the mountains where they could try to do guerrilla warfare, but they weren't doing too good. Now, in 1793, France declared war on Britain and Spain. So Spain's thinking, so now that they're at war with France, they're going to try to regain the western end of the island and then have the whole thing. So they began supplying the insurgents. That's what they called revolting slaves. They were called the insurgents. They supplied them with arms and encouragement. And 4,000 Spanish troops, along with their insurgent allies, launched an invasion of the North Province here. Now the British, since they were now at war with France, they decided they were going to seize the French West Indian colonies. They seized Tobago, Martinique, St. Lucia, and Guadeloupe. Then the British Navy launched an invasion of Saint-Domingue to capture France's most important colony, but also to stop the slave revolt from spreading to Britain's most important colony, Jamaica. It's not on the map, but Jamaica, the end of Jamaica is right about here. It's very close, just south of Cuba and very close to Saint-Domingue. Now, in August of that year, with the Spanish army and their insurgents attacking in the north, and with the British preparing to invade the western and southern ports, one of the peace commissioners, Sontenac, decreed the abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue. But it's not what the slaves thought it meant. He simply were hoping that the ex-slaves, the insurgents, would simply now return to the plantations where they would work, not as slaves, but as paid labor. But at least this way, the French wouldn't have to fight them and could only fight the Spanish and the British. Now, with the Spanish controlling most of the North Province and the British controlling most of the West and South provinces, a French defeat was only a matter of time. So early 1794, the French National Convention, that's the new government of France now with the new constitution, they declared the abolition of slavery in all of the French colonies. Now, they really didn't have any French colonies. The British had seized all of them, and they sort of had Saint-Domingue, but they were about to lose it to the Spanish and the British. So really, they declared the abolition of slavery in the colonies as a way to start the slave revolt in these other colonies that the British had seized, and maybe it would spread to Jamaica. So they were just trying to create chaos, basically.
Hey, Jerry?
Yes, sir?
Quick question, just because we've had some problems on this in the past. Are you still showing the slide of the Bahama Islands and
yes.
speak to me? Okay, good. All right, that's fine.
There. Yeah, it's going to be up there for a while. I'm just reading a bit from my notes, so this way you don't have to look at me. You can look at the picture.
Oh, that's cool. All right.
Okay. So the French National Convention declared the abolition of slavery. Now, word of this got back to Saint-Domingue. Upon hearing of the French government's declaration, Toussaint Louverture, who was one of the insurgent leaders allied with the Spanish, he decided he was going to switch sides. And he was going to fight alongside the French against both the Spanish and the British. And this was a decision that would change the course of history. During the next year, the Spanish were driven back eastward into Spanish Santo Domingo. The British were driven back to the coast, and they only held a few of the ports. In Europe, Spain had withdrawn from the coalition against France, and they withdrew from the fighting in Saint-Domingue, and they ceded all of Santo Domingo to France. They gave them the whole eastern part of the island, although the Spanish stayed there to administer it. It was officially part of France now. Most of these insurgents who had fought with the Spanish, they would all join Toussaint's army, and he soon controlled most of the North Province, which is here, and the West Province, which is here. And because of his efforts, the National Convention promoted Toussaint to Brigadier General in the French Army. So the next year, with the Spanish out of the fighting and the British only having a few ports, they had to make a decision. So they decided to launch, they called it the Great Push. They sent 30,000 men and 200 ships to try to conquer Saint-Domingue. So they'd come with their navy and just bomb all of the ports, and General Toussaint sort of had to use guerrilla tactics, pull back to the interior, try to hit them and pull back so that his army wouldn't be destroyed. But the British also were doing a lot of this subterfuge stuff. They secretly encouraged the commander at Le Cap Français, right here, the capital of North Province. They convinced him to capture the governor and to take over. But General Toussaint sent 10,000 troops. He rescued the governor, and the governor made General Toussaint the lieutenant governor of Saint-Domingue. So he's a brigadier general, and he's the lieutenant governor of Saint-Domingue. Anyway, the fighting continued. In 1797, General John Graves Simcoe, this is the former lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, became the commander-in-chief. He arrived in February, but by August, he returned to Britain because he said the government failed to provide him enough troops and supplies that he felt were necessary to win. So also at this time, malaria and yellow fever were attacking the troops as well. They were dying of disease. And for his success in fighting the British, the French Directory, this is the new government in France, they made General Toussaint the commander-in-chief of all the French forces in Saint-Domingue. So they had great respect for this, his leadership. Now, show you the next slide. Just during the 5 years of the British invasion of Saint-Domingue, it would cost them more than £7 million, as well as over 20,000 casualties. And the British Army had purchased over 13,000 slaves to raise African slave regiments to do the fighting for them, which made them the largest single buyer of slaves in the Caribbean. So much for General Simcoe's anti-slavery sentiment. Now, okay, this is a better map. You can see the North Province, West Province, and the South Province. Now, General Toussaint began to negotiate agreement with the next British general, General Maitland, to begin the British withdrawal from most of Saint-Domingue. That Britain would promise not to invade Saint-Domingue again if General Toussaint promised never to attack Jamaica, and he agreed to that. Maitland also proposed that if Saint-Domingue would declare independence from France, they would receive the protection of the British Navy from the French. Now, General Toussaint rejected this because he did not fully trust Saint-Domingue's future to the British Empire after fighting him for 5 years. At this same time, the Directory sent an agent, Vattel, who arrived with the Directory's secret plan for an invasion of Jamaica and later of the southern United States. This would help to spread the slave revolt, but it would also get Toussaint out of the way, and Vattel felt then he could reestablish French control over the island. Now, General Toussaint rejected this invasion of Jamaica because he knew such a plan would destroy his army. And, quote, the old system might be restored in Saint-Domingue and slavery reestablished. He realized it was just like George Washington. you could not lose your army. You could lose battles all you want, but you couldn't lose the army. At that point, it was all over. That's why you fought guerrilla warfare, so you didn't have a head-on confrontation and lose. So 1799, the next year. Now, General Toussaint, not trusting either the French or the British, decided that he could trust the Americans. And he sent a businessman from Le Cap, along with the American consul, Jacobin, to Philadelphia, where they met with Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. They met with some congressmen, and secretly they met with President Adams at dinner. And they proposed that trade with America would be permitted and American ships would be protected in all of Saint-Domingue's ports. Now, at this time, the United States and France were basically at war. They call it the quasi-war. France was trying to get the United States to openly ally with them in the war against Britain, and the United States wished to remain neutral to all this nonsense going on in Europe. So the French says, well, okay, then you're not honoring the treaties, so we don't have to honor neutral ships. So they began seizing any American ship they found in the Caribbean. There was something like over 400 ships that would be seized. Now, after their meetings with President Adams and Pickering and the congressmen, in the United States Congress, a bill was introduced and debated to continue the suspension of trade with France, but it included a new clause that would allow U.S. trade with Saint-Domingue. This was called Toussaint's Clause. Now, and the bill was passed. So at the same time, Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, wrote a letter to Alexander Hamilton informing us that the bill was being passed and we would be having trade with Saint-Domingue. And he asked Hamilton for a plan for Saint-Domingue to administer the government. Now, I'm going to show this later, but this is at the time when Hamilton gets this later. To avoid all the overcomplication of the issue of independence and everything, Hamilton alone seems to have understood the reality of Saint-Domingue, that there was very little in the way of democratic institutions on which to base a representative government, and that law and order was maintained by the army. So he also understood General Toussaint that he had not proposed independence, and he wished to remain loyal to France, because remember, how many nations on earth had abolished slavery? To his knowledge, only one, France. General Toussaint was not committed to independence. He was determined to defend the freedom of his fellow former slaves at all costs. He was fighting for freedom, not for independence. He would only fight for independence if it became absolutely necessary in order to defend their freedom. And Hamilton understood that, and none of these other people do, and they're all babbling about, oh, they should declare independence and we can get more trade with them. But no, that wasn't going to happen. That was not General Toussaint's intention. Now, after this, Secretary of State Pickering sent an advance shipment of pay, clothing, and provisions for Toussaint's troops, sort of credit, which was very nice of him to show that, you know, this was going to be friendly relations between the United States and Saint-Domingue. Also sent was Dr. Edward Stevens, who was appointed the Consul General. And when he went, he took Hamilton's plan with him to Saint-Domingue to give to General Toussaint. Now, Dr. Stevens, turns out, was Hamilton's oldest and closest friend. They had grown up together as boys in the Caribbean and met later in the United States. Also, in 1793, Hamilton and his wife had caught yellow fever in Philadelphia. And Stevens basically had saved their lives. There was some wacko theories of how to combat it. You know, they'd put leeches on you, or they'd bleed you, or give you these powerful purgatives. Stevens, because he had grown up in the Caribbean, knew yellow fever, and he had an idea of how you could fight it, which he did with, I think he used ice baths with Hamilton and his wife, and they recovered. So he saved Hamilton's life. While he was in Saint-Domingue, he would also uncover a plot by the agent of the Directory to invade the southern U.S., and he informed General Toussaint of this, and this plot was squashed by Toussaint.
Hey, Jerry.
Now,
hey, Jerry.
Yep.
We're getting a message from one of our members in BC, Kevin, who's been trying to join, but you might have to accept his
Okay.
desire to enter. I don't know if you're getting a message saying someone's trying to join.
2 people entered the waiting room.
Oh, there's 2 people. Yeah, you have to keep your eyes on that and hit admit. Admit all.
Where do I see that?
Click
Madeline, help him.
Yeah.
Click on those 2 people.
Oh, those 2
Okay.
people. Admit.
Yes. And then it says, yes, admit.
Admit.
And there will be other people who've been trying to get on, I've discovered, but have been locked out. So you have to really keep your eyes on that little notification.
But it will show up on the top of your screen when you're in slide mode.
Right.
People who want to get in are going to be at the top center of your screen.
Okay. Okay, I was reading from my notes. I got to stare at the screen.
You guys scared?
Okay.
Yeah, the screen is important to look up to, yeah.
Okay. So, go back to there. Share. Here. Okay, are we back?
Yep.
You can see my little map again?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so at this point, General Toussaint and Dr. Stevens negotiated a trade agreement between the United States and Saint-Domingue. And they then negotiated a secret treaty with Maitland for Britain to join this. Now, although Toussaint didn't trust Britain, but because of the British naval superiority, he knew any agreement with the United States would be useless without an agreement from the British Navy as well. So they got Britain to become part of this treaty too. And so then President Adams would issue a proclamation to reopen trade with Saint-Domingue, and he sent Commodore Talbot and the USS Constitutions, which was one of the 6 frigates that were built for the new U.S. Navy. So one of their only 6 ships he sent with a few others as a fleet to be stationed at Le Cap in Saint-Domingue. So we got the U.S. Navy down there. Now, immediately after this secret treaty, General Rigaud, who was the commander of the South Province here, Toussaint was the commander of the North and the West here. So in the South, with the connivance of Haiteville, who's the French agent for the Directory, he launched an attack against General Toussaint and started a revolt of the gens de couleur in the North and the West provinces against Toussaint's army. So it was like a civil war at that point. Now, after Toussaint was finally able to suppress the uprising in the North, he then began to move to launch an offensive in the South. And he reached an agreement with Dr. Stevens to allow a squadron of ships to sail to Jacobin here, where he could blockade the port, but also to resupply Toussaint's troops. But the British, claiming that they feared that squadron was destined for Jamaica, they seized the ships. So now Toussaint doesn't have a navy because that was all he had. So then Commodore Talbot and Stevens got together and they sent Captain Perry and the USS General Green, one of the American vessels, south to Jacobin. both to stop Rigaud's gunboats that were actually attacking American merchant ships in the area, in the southern ports, but also to stop this clandestine trade that was going on between Jacmel and the British colony of St. Thomas. And that's how the British had been secretly supplying Rigaud. Also, this would assist General Toussaint in the capture of Jacmel. So, with Captain Perry firing on Rigaud's forts as Jacmel, General Toussaint was able to storm them, and they captured that. And soon the fighting in the south was over, and Rigaud, he fled to France to cry in Bonaparte's ear about how bad a person Toussaint is. The first thing General Toussaint does is issue a proclamation of clemency to all of the inhabitants of the South. He's not going to take revenge. There's no, punishment for that. Just clemency. Now, after that, in France, a coup has installed Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul in another new government. And General Toussaint receives a decree from Bonaparte that says, French colonies will be ruled by special laws. This disposition derives from the nature of things and the differences in climate. I laugh whenever I read it because it sounds like he's getting advice from David Suzuki, the nature of things and climate change. So the inhabitants of French colonies located in America, Asia, and Africa cannot be governed by the same laws. The differences in habits, in mores, in interests, the diversity of soil, crops, and goods produced demands diverse modifications. Now, what is Bonaparte hinting at? What's his intention? Because this David Suzuki speech just does not make sense at all. So at that point, Toussaint knows he's in for trouble, so he informs the Spanish governor of Santo Domingo that he was taking control from France. Remember, Spain had ceded it to France back in 1795, 5 years ago, and it's still being administered by the Spanish. Now, General Toussaint is the commander-in-chief of all the French forces there, and he's the lieutenant governor, so he has the authority to do that. Also, there's a reason why he did it. What was happening is that the Spanish were sneaking into the French part of Saint-Domingue onto the plantations and capturing some of the freedmen and bringing them back to Santo Domingo, where they were sold back into slavery for Cuba. So that's really why he was doing it, not all this nonsense about he wanted to be dictator over everything. No, his intention from day one was to end slavery, and now he had a chance to do it on the whole island. The first thing he did was he proclaimed amnesty to all of the Spanish colonists. He abolished slavery throughout the entire United Island, and he called an election. 10 men were to be chosen for a central assembly, 2 from each of the 5 departments. The 3 in the French part, the North, West, and South provinces, and the 2 provinces of the former Spanish part. And this assembly was to draft a constitution, a new constitution for Saint-Domingue, using Hamilton's draft as a model, and also using, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. That's what he was going to use as his model. On July 3rd, 1801, the new Constitution was proclaimed into law. Now, here's what I want to go into. Okay, here is Hamilton's letter that he wrote February 21st, 1799, when Secretary of State Pickering asked him, and he gave it to Dr. Stevens to bring and give to General Toussaint. Hamilton says, no regular system of liberty will at present suit Saint-Domingue. The government, if independent, must be military, partaking of the feudal system. A hereditary chief would be best, but this, I fear, is impractical. Let there be then a single executive to hold his place for life. He was thinking of General Toussaint. The person to succeed on a vacancy to be either the officer next in command in the island at the time of the death of the predecessor, or the person who, by plurality of voices of the commandants of regiments, shall be designated within a certain time. So he was saying you have a council of the commanders of the regiments who will decide who is the next chief, and also whether he's going to remain there. All the males within certain ages to be arranged in military corps and to be compellable to military service. This may be connected with the tenure of land. Let the supreme judiciary authority be invested in 12 judges to be chosen for life by the generals or chief military officers, the circle of officers. The powers of war and treaty to be in the executive to be obliged to have 3 ministers. This is interesting: finance, war, and foreign affairs, whom he shall nominate to the generals for their approbation or rejection. The colonels and generals, when once appointed to hold their offices during good behavior, removable only by conviction of an infamous crime in due course of law, or the sentence of a court-martial cashiering them. Duties of import and export, taxes on land and buildings to constitute the chief branches of revenue. These thoughts are very crude, but perhaps they may afford some hints. So Hamilton was basically saying it should be a military-type government because he would need that to keep the country together and defend their freedom. Now, for Hamilton, this was nothing new. Hamilton was attacked as a monarchist, wanting to have a, hereditary monarch in the United States, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is what Hamilton presented as his plan of government at the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. The supreme legislative power of the United States of America to be vested in 2 distinct bodies of men, the one to be called the Assembly and the other the Senate, who together shall form the legislature of the United States with power to pass all laws whatsoever, subject to the negative hereafter mentioned. The Assembly to consist of persons elected by the people to serve for 3 years. The Senate to consist of persons elected to serve during good behavior. He wanted the Senate to serve for life because it would take it away from, immediate changes of opinion among the electorate. And their election would be made by electors, chosen for the purpose by the people. So the people would vote for an elector, sit in an electoral college, and they would decide after 4 or 5 years if that senator was going to remain a senator or not. So, continuing, the supreme executive authority of the United States to be vested in a governor to be elected to serve during good behavior. Hamilton was proposing that the president serve for life, meaning General Washington. His election to be made by electors, chosen by the people. Not direct election by the people, but chosen by electors. And the electors are chosen directly by the people. The government to have a negative upon all laws, he would have a veto, on all laws about to be passed, and to have the execution of all laws passed. To be the commander-in-chief of the land and naval forces and of the militia of the United States. He's in charge of the army. To have the direction of war when authorized or begun, to have with the advice and approbation of the Senate the power of making all treaties, to have the appointments of the heads or chief officers of the Department of Finance, War, and Foreign Affairs, the three departments he proposed that General Toussaint have in his government too. The supreme judicial authority of the United States to be invested in 12 judges to hold their offices during good behavior for life with adequate and permanent salaries. So during the Constitutional Convention, they had put forward a plan that was called the Virginia Plan. And it was being attacked all over the place, and people didn't like this and that. Hamilton gave this speech. After this speech, nobody questioned his plan, and nobody complained about the Virginia Plan after that. The interesting thing is, although some of this was voted on, it wasn't adopted, the part about good behavior was agreed to by the Virginia delegation, which included James Madison. Now, later Hamilton is attacked as being a monarchist because he proposed a president for life, but the delegation for Virginia agreed to that at the Constitutional Convention. So that's the hypocrisy of the attacks on Hamilton on this. Now, here's a slide that I stole from Sam, his class on Vattel, the Law of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 3, number 28. The perfection of a state and its aptitude to attain the ends of society must then depend on its constitution. Consequently, the most important concern of a nation that forms a political society, and its first and most essential duty towards itself, is to choose the best constitution possible, and that most suitable to its circumstances. So it's not a utopian idea of, the great democratic idea of Thomas Jefferson. No. You pick the best constitution possible and the one that's most suitable to the circumstances you have at the time. But when it makes this choice, it lays the foundation of its own preservation, safety, perfection, and happiness. In other words, the intention of the Constitution is what is important, not the actual, outline of it. It's the intention that's important. You cannot take too much care in placing these on a solid basis. Okay, that's Vattel. Now, to duplicate that idea, here's something, when Hamilton's in this big fight against Jefferson about the National Bank, they both write an essay. Hamilton writes an opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. And you read this and you can just see he's been studying Vattel, because it's right out of that book. It's amazing. That every power vested in a government is in its nature sovereign, and includes, by force of the term, a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power, and which are not precluded by restrictions and exemptions specified in the Constitution, or that are not immoral, and they're not contrary to the essential ends of political society. So you can't just have the right to employ all means, period. No. It may be truly said of every government, as well as of that of the United States, that it has only a right to pass such laws as are necessary and proper to accomplish the objects entrusted to it. For no government has a right to do merely what it pleases. The degree in which a measure is necessary can never be a test of the legal right to adopt it. Hamilton's against the idea of necessity. You have to do something because it's necessary. That's simply a matter of opinion and can only be a test of expediency. The relation between the measure and the end, between the nature of the mean employed toward the execution of a power and the object of that power, must be the criterion of constitutionality. In other words, the intention of the Constitution, not the more or less of necessity or utility. And that's a direct attack on Jefferson, who he accuses of doing something only of necessity or utilitarianism. So that's just Hamilton as his best, and you can see the school of Vattel, where it comes from. Now, just as a little aside, I put in the Constitution Act for Canada for 1791, just to compare it. This is funny. The Constitution Act for Canada, 1791. Whereas an act was passed in the 14th year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled An Act for Making More Effectual Provision for the Government of the Province of Quebec in North America. He's referring to the Quebec Act of 1774. They're going to amend it. And whereas the said act is in many respects inapplicable to the present condition and circumstances of the said provinces, okay, so far, and whereas it is expedient and necessary that further provision should now be made for the good government and prosperity thereof. Obviously, these guys don't read Vattel or they don't read Hamilton. He just told you you can't rely on something being expedient or necessary, yet the British reason for this new act is because it is expedient and necessary. But Hamilton says that can't be the intention. That's simply a matter of opinion. So what's the intention of this thing? Oh, I forgot the last sentence. May it therefore please your most excellent majesty that it be enacted. So the intention of the Constitution Act for Canada is to please your majesty. God, it's right there in black and white. I don't lie. Okay, now let's go to the good stuff. The Constitution of Saint-Domingue, that General Toussaint got his Central Assembly to pass. Okay. The representatives of the colony of Saint-Domingue gathered in Central Assembly have arrested and established the constitutional bases of the regime of the French colony of Saint-Domingue as follows. Article 3. There cannot exist slaves on this territory. Servitude is therein forever abolished. All men are born, live, and die free and French. Very simple, and that's the intention of the entire Constitution. Never before done. I don't know how long it took before other countries put that in their Constitution, but the intention is right there. All men, regardless of color, are eligible to all employment. Article 5, there shall exist no distinction other than those based on virtue and talent, and other superiority afforded by law in the exercise of a public function. The law is the same for all, whether in punishment or in protection. And I just want to compare it to the Declaration of the Rights of Man from France, 1789. When the French Revolution started, and it started so well before it was destroyed by the Jacobins. Article 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on considerations of the common good. Article 6, all citizens being equal in its eyes shall be equally eligible to all high offices, public positions, and employments according to their ability, and without other distinction than that of their virtues and talents. Word for word, Toussaint takes the Declaration of the Rights of Man and puts it in his Constitution right there as part of the intention of the Constitution. Now later on, the colonial regime is determined by laws proposed by the governor and rendered by a gathering of inhabitants who shall meet at fixed periods at the central seat of the colony under the title Central Assembly of Saint-Domingue. So he rejected Hamilton's idea of a central committee of the generals, I guess he didn't trust all of them, and instead he decided to have a central assembly, since that's what drafted this Constitution, so he had confidence in them. So the Central Assembly of Saint-Domingue shall be composed of 2 representatives of each department, who to be eligible shall be at least 30 years of age and have resided for 5 years in the colonies. The assembly shall be renewed every 2 years by half, and no one shall be a member for 6 consecutive years. He doesn't want the assembly to be there for life. No. Now, next slide. The administrative direction of the government shall be entrusted to a governor who corresponds directly with the government of the metropole. That means with France, central government in France, on all matters relative to the interests of the colonies. So he's saying Saint-Domingue is going to have a constitution, but we are part of France. We are a colony of France. We're not independents. There's no word about independence anywhere in this document, because France is the only nation on earth that abolished slavery. And Toussaint is committed. His intention is to remain with France. Article 28, the Constitution nominates the citizen Toussaint Louverture, Chief General of the Army of Saint-Domingue, and in consideration for important services rendered to the colony in the most critical circumstances of the Revolution, and upon the wishes of the grateful inhabitants, he has entrusted the direction thereof for the remainder of his glorious life. The interesting thing about Toussaint is he was never paid. His entire career as general in the army and lieutenant governor, he never accepted a cent. It's like General Washington when he was head of the army. He never was paid. Article 29, in the future, each governor shall be nominated for 5 years and shall continue every 5 years for reason of his good administration. So the Central Assembly will decide every 5 years whether the governor will continue or not. Now, okay, so that was...
Hey, Jerry.
Yes, sir?
Is the Central Assembly made up of elected people? I missed that one.
Yes.
Okay.
It's 2 people elected from each department.
Right.
So there are 10 people in the assembly. The same way that they elected 10 people to an assembly to draft the Constitution. It's the same assembly that he wants to keep. So it's small, but that's their government that is the best possible and the most suitable, according to Vattel. Okay, now what happens next? Oh boy, that's Napoleon Bonaparte on the left, and the other is General Toussaint on the right. Now, 1801, after the Constitution is proclaimed, General Toussaint receives word that a French expedition was being prepared to sail to Saint-Domingue, the city in the Spanish part, which would be used as a base to launch an invasion of Saint-Domingue. So he knows that Napoleon is launching an invasion before he gets here. France has a treaty with the United States now, and they have now just signed a peace agreement with Britain. And France's other colonies have been restored by Britain to France. So Bonaparte, plus his foreign secretary, Talleyrand, who was not a nice guy. Bonaparte used to call him shit in the silk stockings, and that's probably appropriate. Anyway, Bonaparte and Talleyrand wished to reestablish France's colonial empire. They wanted the money. That was their intention, money. So how are they going to do it? Well, first you got to recolonize Saint-Domingue. Once you do that, you can supply Saint-Domingue and the other colonies with foodstuffs that will be grown in Louisiana. He had just acquired Louisiana from Spain. So this was Bonaparte's idea of the French colonial empire. Louisiana, which had slavery at that time, would provide the foodstuffs which would then feed the slaves who are worked to death to produce the coffee and everything else on the plantations. Now, President Jefferson, the new president at the time, he agreed with France's aims. Due to the recent slave rebellion they had in Virginia, and fears that slaves would come to the United States with their refugee masters from Saint-Domingue, had been infected with the malady of insurrection, and they were spreading this to the slaves in the United States. So he was agreeing with France's policy. Now, just so we don't have to look at that guy anymore, Bonaparte would send a message to General Toussaint that the Constitution you made, while including many good things, contains some that are contrary to the dignity and sovereignty of the French people, of which Saint-Domingue forms only a portion. The circumstances in which you found yourself surrounded on all sides by enemies without the metropole being able to either assist or revictual you, rendered articles of that Constitution legitimate that otherwise would not be. Now, he doesn't say what part of the Constitution he disagrees with, but as I showed you, I mean, Toussaint modeled it on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. But maybe that's what Bonaparte disagrees with. Anyway, we'll see what Bonaparte's intentions are a little later. So Bonaparte sends his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, with 45 ships and 12,000 troops to Saint-Domingue, along with secret instructions from Talleyrand. So Talleyrand divides it into 3 periods. The first period, occupy the strongholds, the ports, the cities, then arm and organize all the whites, mulattoes, and loyal blacks into a national guard. During the second period, the rebels, those who refuse to join his national guard but are still fighting him, the rebels shall be pursued to the death. In the third period, Toussaint and his generals shall be deceived and loaded with attentions at first, and then later arrested and shipped off to France. So that was Bonaparte's plan for how he was going to reconquer Saint-Domingue. Now, he figured this would take maybe 2-3 weeks. Okay? 2-3 weeks, huh? So Leclerc arrived in January and began his plan of attack. Now Toussaint, massively outnumbered by these crack troops, these were some of Napoleon's best troops. What his plan was when the town was attacked, his garrison in the town would set fire to the town and then fall back into the interior of the province. And Leclerc would enter a city of smoke and ruins, and then continue his attack and have the same thing. He was entering a city of smoke and ruins. In February, 13 more ships and 3,800 more troops arrived from France for Leclerc. In April, another 10 ships and 5,500 more troops arrived. He had 20,000 troops total now. And General Toussaint knew that because France had peace with Britain and with the United States, this meant that France could deal with their colonies without any interference. And he feared even more troops would be sent from France. And remember, Leclerc's instruction had been, if it had been impossible to get Toussaint to surrender, proclaim that if within a specified time he does not come to take the oath to the Republic, he shall be declared a traitor, after which period a war to the death will begin. Now, General Toussaint was fearing the disintegration of his army in France's war to the death. And so General Toussaint and his generals surrendered, provided that Leclerc guaranteed freedom to all the inhabitants, which he did. At least that's what he told Toussaint. Because provided that the French Republic, the only nation that had abolished slavery, remained true to that conviction, General Toussaint continued his belief that the only path for freedom was for Saint-Domingue was as a part of France. So he and his generals surrendered so that the army wouldn't be massacred, and Leclerc promised freedom to all the inhabitants. After that, Toussaint was retired to his plantation. Leclerc invited Toussaint to a meeting, and when Toussaint was seated, soldiers rushed in with bayonets into the room, arrested Toussaint, chained him, and shipped him off to France. General Toussaint was kept in a prison at a military fort in the far east of France in the Jura Mountains near the Swiss border. He was not allowed a hearing or a trial. Bonaparte set his aide-de-camp to interview Toussaint, to get him to confess that he had sought independence. But General Toussaint only replied truthfully that he had always been faithful to the French Republic. His only request was for a proper tribunal, which Bonaparte wouldn't give him. Now, while he was in prison, Toussaint dictated his memoirs to the commandant of the jail's secretary to justify all of his actions since 1802, since Leclerc arrived. That May, Bonaparte proclaimed that in Tobago, St. Lucia, and Martinique, slavery will be maintained, and the slave trade and their importation into the colonies will take place in accordance with the laws and regulation prior to 1789, prior to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's going back to the ancien regime, the king. In July, Bonaparte annulled the law of February 1794 of the National Assembly that had abolished slavery in all of France's colonies. And he reestablished slavery in Guadeloupe and Saint-Domingue and maintained slavery in Louisiana. So you can see what Bonaparte's disagreement was with Toussaint's constitution. The minute he got Toussaint out of the way, he reestablished slavery in all of the colonies. Now, when word of this arrived in Saint-Domingue, by October, the black regiments in the Saint-Domingue army mutinied and a new rebellion began again. On November 2nd, a conference of all the rebel generals selected Dessalines as their commander-in-chief. So all the regiments were united into one army now to fight Leclerc. That same day that the generals had their conference, Leclerc died of yellow fever. And his second in command, Rochambeau, continued. And he continued a campaign of terror in a war to the death. Now, next slide. Okay.
Sorry, Jerry.
Yes, sir.
Give me just to get back on the timeline. What year was Toussaint's constitution presented, and what year did this all happen in?
The Constitution was in 1801.
Okay.
July of 1801.
Okay, and everything you just went through with Napoleon reverting back to this monarchical pro-slavery policy, this was the same year?
1802.
Okay, and Toussaint was taken hostage, not hostage, but imprisoned in France In what year?
1802.
Thank you. Okay, that was it.
Yeah. And once Napoleon had him, then he, in May, declared the restoration of slavery. So, yeah, 1801, there's no more war in Saint-Domingue. There's a constitution, there's an elected government, there's peace on the island. Toussaint is trying to restart the economy. He's trying to get some of the big whites to come back because he needs people who know how to run a plantation. A lot of people are arguing with him, but he says, hey, they know how to do it. There's no slavery anymore, but they know how to manage it. So in the middle of this is when Bonaparte wants to recolonize Saint-Domingue in 1802. January 1802 is when Leclerc actually arrives in Saint-Domingue. So all of this is being prepared, you know, the last part of 81. So in 83, April 7th, 1803, General Toussaint died and was buried in an unmarked grave in the basement of the fort's chapel. The one man who probably did more to end slavery than anyone else. And the one man who could have kept Saint-Domingue as part of France. Now, 3 days later, Toussaint dies April 7th, 1803. 3 days later, April 10th, 1803, Bonaparte is now thinking about the inevitable coming war with Britain and his need for money to finance it. So he's a meeting with his ministers and he announces that he's thinking of selling Louisiana. Now remember, he thought this was going to take 3 weeks to recolonize it. So this is 15 months later, and he's farther behind. He's lost 50,000 men to the fighting and to disease, yellow fever, in Saint-Domingue. And Rochambeau is requesting 35,000 more men and more supplies. So Bonaparte cannot afford to lose more men and more money to that quagmire of a war in Saint-Domingue. So he decides he's going to sell Louisiana. He also knew that in a war with Britain, one of the first things Britain is going to do would be to seize Louisiana, just as they seized France's colonies, the island colonies, when they were at war before. Now, the Americans are looking and saying, oh, either way, this is stopping the American Western progress. Remember, like the map in Pascal's class of the Quebec Act, where the British have all of British North America, and then if they seize Louisiana, they have all of this again, and the United States, that's it. They're not going past the Mississippi. So General Toussaint's commitment to freedom of Saint-Domingue and his resistance to the French conquest, even after he was captured by his other generals, led to the selling of Louisiana. And that's why it is correct to say that without Toussaint Louverture, the United States would never have bought Louisiana or never been offered it. Now, so this is April 10th. By May 3rd, they signed an agreement to sell it. Now, interesting, on July 4th, the purchase of Louisiana is announced in the United States. President Jefferson does it as the 4th of July celebration in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. On July 4th, everybody in the United States learns about the purchase of Louisiana. The very next day, on July 5th, Alexander Hamilton wrote in his newspaper, the New York Evening Post, approving the purchase. Now, a lot of people were against it. Hamilton, the next day, wrote and agreed to it. Now, you ask, why is that? Well, this goes back a way now to 1793, but one of the American captains, Captain Robert Gray, I don't know if he's any relation to Brian, it'd be nice if he was. Robert Gray was the first American to circumnavigate the globe in 1787 to 1790. on his way to China. The next year after that, he explored the northwest coast of North America. And he went up and he found the mouth of this great bay with this great river coming into it. And he took readings, the latitude and longitude. He knew where it was, right there. And later we call it the Columbia River. He didn't know where it was. He just knew that was the mouth of this river. So in 1793, the American Philosophical Society of Philadelphia proposed an expedition to find an overland route to this bay in the Pacific Ocean. Now, it got aborted when they discovered that the man they chose to lead the mission was a French agent. But when this thing was proposed by the American Philosophical Society, it was subscribed to by Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington. So they all had the intention that America someday would reach the Pacific Ocean. That was in 93. So 10 years later, when the United States acquires Louisiana from France, Hamilton comes out the next day and approves of it. So by November, the British are fighting the French. They're blockading all of the ports of Saint-Domingue. Rochambeau's got no supplies left, and he surrenders to the British Navy. And Britain and France, they leave Saint-Domingue. That's it. So on January 1st, 1804, Saint-Domingue declares its independence, and it is renamed Haiti, the original name of the island by the indigenous people that Columbus found. Unfortunately, General Toussaint is not there to lead in the reconstruction, which is a real problem. Now that's in January 1804. In May of 1804, Napoleon is made emperor. Now Louisiana. Now, as I said, due to General Toussaint's defense of Saint-Domingue's constitution and the abolishing of slavery forever, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States. But not everybody supported the purchase of Louisiana. Hamilton did the very next day. Now, originally, President Jefferson had sent his envoys, Monroe and Livingston, to France with instructions to purchase Florida. Right here. He wanted to purchase particularly West Florida and the island of New Orleans. That's all he wanted. It was a port down the Mississippi. And these rivers in southern United States all enter into the Gulf of Mexico, but through West Florida. So he wanted to have access to these ports so they could ship goods from Georgia territory through there. So Jefferson only wanted to buy the Floridas, not Louisiana. He still wanted the Mississippi to be the western boundary of the United States. And even after the purchase of Louisiana, Jefferson's idea was for Native Americans living in the Ohio country, that's all of this here, there's the Ohio River. So natives living here to exchange their lands that are east of the Mississippi for lands west of the Mississippi with all the settlers there, and then the settlers will go settle east of the Mississippi. So he was going to make Louisiana basically Indian territory or, native territory and still have the Mississippi as the boundary of the United States. Now, Hamilton, as we saw, openly supported the acquisition of Louisiana. But a group of disgruntled Federalists from New England around Timothy Pickering, who is now a senator, he had been fired by President Adams. And the senators around him from New England, they call it the Essex Junto. Now, they feared that Louisiana was going to change the balance of power in the United States, away from the northern states to the western states. So they actually began planning for a secession of the northern New England states out of the Union. They were going to leave the states. Now, This plot came to include the then Vice President, Aaron Burr, and the British Minister to the United States, Anthony Merry. The plan was that Burr was to become the governor of New York, and with him controlling New York would then join the secession, and it would work. They needed New York. But Hamilton helped to stop the election of Burr as New York governor in 1804, just as he stopped Burr from becoming president in 1801. Now, Burr's no longer vice president. He's not governor of New York. He's nothing. So he then becomes involved in a new plot with General Wilkinson, who's the head of the United States Army, General Williamson, who's, well, he used to be involved in selling land in upstate New York, and now he's actually on the payroll of the British government. He's a British agent. And the British minister, Anthony Merry. The plan is to invade and seize Texas from the Spanish and to join it with Louisiana and even the western states like Kentucky and Tennessee into a new empire. And I guess Burr saw himself as the new empire, the new Napoleon of this new empire. But, you know, he knew there was one man still standing in his way of this, Hamilton. So Burr devised some crazy excuse where he demanded an answer from Hamilton from remarks that Hamilton had made about Burr during the election campaign for governor. Now, if Hamilton had agreed to it, it would have been a humiliating apology from Hamilton, which would have destroyed his remaining influence with the Federalists in New York. And his leadership in New York would have been removed. That's what he was seeking. Hamilton wrote about this, you know, before the duel with Burr. He wrote notes on why he was agreed to it, even though he was against dueling. And his son had just died in a duel a couple years earlier. And Hamilton wrote, "The ability to be in future useful, whether in resisting mischief or effecting good, in those crises of our public affairs which seem likely to happen, would probably be inseparable from a conformity with public prejudice in this particular." So that the humiliation of writing an apology to Burr or not accepting the duel would have made him useless in resisting mischief, meaning stopping the secession. The last letter Hamilton wrote before he died, he was discussing that there was going to be a meeting in November of the Federalists in Boston, and he was going to attend to argue against the secession. So even right until his death, he was leading the battle to preserve the Union. Now, this secession of the northern states, this is the effect on Canada. Now, these are just some of the letters that Pickering wrote, just to give you an idea how open this conspiracy was among these, this group, the junto. From Pickering to Richard Peters on December 24th, 1803. Although the end of all our revolutionary labors and expectations is disappointment, and our fond hopes of Republican happiness are vanity, and the real patriots of '76 are overwhelmed by the modern pretenders to that character, I will not yet despair. I will rather anticipate a new confederacy, exempt from the corrupting influence and oppression of the aristocratic Democrats of the South. There will be, and our children at farthest will see it, a separation. The white and black population will mark the boundary. The British provinces, even with the assent of Britain, will become members of the Northern Confederacy. He means Canada and Nova Scotia by that. So somehow he's already certain that this will happen. A continued tyranny of the present ruling sect will precipitate that event. The patience of good citizens is now nearly exhausted. Here's another one. From Pickering to George Cabot, January 29, 1804. But when and how is a separation to be effected? If federalism is crumbling away in New England, there is no time to be lost, lest it should be overwhelmed and become unable to attempt its own relief. Its last refuge is New England. An immediate exertion, perhaps, its only hope. It must begin in Massachusetts. The proposition would be welcomed in Connecticut, and could we doubt of New Hampshire? But New York must be associated. And how is her concurrence to be obtained? She must be made the center of the Confederacy. Vermont and New Jersey would follow, of course, and Rhode Island of necessity. We suppose the British provinces in Canada and Nova Scotia at no remote period, perhaps without delay, and with the assent of Great Britain, how does he know that, may become members of the Northern League. Certainly, that government can feel only disgust at our present rulers. She will be pleased to see them crestfallen. She will not regret the proposed division of empire. If with her own consent she relinquishes her provinces, she will be rid of the charge of maintaining them, while she will derive from them, as she does from us, all the commercial returns which her merchants now receive. A liberal treaty of amity and commerce will form a bond of union between Great Britain and the Northern Confederacy, highly useful to both. Okay, one last letter. This is from Pickering to Rufus King. Rufus King is a close friend of Hamilton, too, March 4th, 1804. He's trying to get Rufus King to join. Hamilton, at the same time, is writing letters to King, advising him not to. The Federalists here in general anxiously desire the election of Mr. Burr to the chair of New York, to be governor of New York, for they despair of a present ascendancy of the federal party. Mr. Burr alone, we think, can break your democratic phalanx, and we anticipate much good from his success. Were New York detached, as under his administration it would be, from the Virginia influence, the whole Union would be benefited. Jefferson would then be forced to observe some caution and forbearance in his measures. And if a separation should be deemed proper, the 5 New England states, New York and New Jersey, would naturally be united. Among those 7 states, there is a sufficient congeniality of character to authorize the expectation of practical harmony and a permanent union. New York the center. Now, I ask, that's my question. The question arises, how did Pickering know that Britain would assent to ceding her North American colonies to this Northern Confederacy? Meetings among the New York Federalist congressmen to discuss secession, beginning by at least December of 1803, included the trader Aaron Burr. This we know, there's mention of his meetings, and must have included Anthony Merry, the British minister to the United States. Now, the British intention in all this is not what Pickering's intention is. The British Empire was in favor of a confederation of the northern states into Canada, right, to split the Union, but not the other way around, not of accession of Canada into the Union. No. This is a quote, I can't remember what I got it from, but it's a British minister, I think, in the 1840s. The Confederated States of British North America, that means including New England states, would virtually hold the balance of power on the continent and lead to the restoration of that influence which more than 80 years ago England was supposed to have lost. Now, this became the future plan of the British Empire, to use Canada as part of the plan to split the United States, which since we've seen since 1803 was to support northern secession, and since the 1830s to support southern secession. Therefore, the British Empire could not allow any real Republican movement in Canada because it would interfere with their future plan. And that's what Pascal was showing us in his class last week. Now, I got one last slide somewhere. I thought I did. Okay, there it is. Now, I'll just be 5 more minutes. I want to show the effect on the United States of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, some historians incorrectly attribute Americans' Western expansion to its inherent desire for conquest, for empire. Now, this desire for conquest does not occur until the mistreatment of the natives under the evil Andrew Jackson administration. Now, some historians incorrectly attribute it to a myth, the rugged individual, that man did not shape the wilderness shaped him. When you get this crazy picture of, the cowboy, and he drinks whiskey and plays cards and smokes cigars, the rugged individual, this kind of nonsense. Now, the truth is, America's Western progress was a war, and it was fought against the existing world's empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Spanish Empire. And it was motivated by the idea of a continental republic. Graham Lauer used to give classes on his book, and he would always tell people, when the American Revolution started and the Congress voted to create an army, and they voted George Washington to be head of it. They created an army and they called it the Continental Army. They didn't call it the American Army. They didn't call it the United States Army, the colonial empire. Think of it. They called it the Continental Army. And members of the army were the Continental soldiers. So they had this conception of a republic all the way to the Pacific. Graham shows going all the way back to the early foundings of the colonies in the United States, but also the founding of the United States Republic in 1776 with the Continental Army. Now, I said earlier, on July 4th, 1803, Louisiana Purchase was announced in the United States. The very next day, July 5th, Meriwether Lewis left Washington, D.C. and began his expedition of discovery that would take him 3.5 years before he was finally back in Washington City. And this was financed by the United States government. So it wasn't, every man for himself, free enterprise nonsense. This was financed by the government. Now, to show you this nonsense of rugged individual, I just want to look at Meriwether Lewis. Okay, before he left, and you can see the map, it shows from St. Louis all the way to the mouth of the Columbia River and back. Before he left on this expedition of discovery, he went and studied with members of the American Philosophical Society. He studied with Andrew Ellicott to learn how to make observations with a sextant, a chronometer, other scientific instruments. Now, you might remember Andrew Ellicott, along with Benjamin Banneker, laid out the city of Washington, D.C. He was a surveyor that did that. So Lewis studied with him. Then he went and studied with the foremost mathematician in the United States, Robert Patterson. I think he was also at the University of Pennsylvania, a professor there, to study how to measure and compute longitude, which if you've ever tried to do it, it's difficult. Anyway, Lewis mastered that. He then studied with Dr. Benjamin Rush to study medicine, You're going on a trip 2-3 years. What happens if someone gets sick? You've got to be able to deal with it. So he had to learn medicine and all these diseases and cures, and he had this huge medicine chest he had to take with him. Dr. Benjamin Barton, he studied with to study botany. All along the trip, he was to take samples of all the different plants and leaves from the trees that he saw, the new ones, and bring them back. He studied with Dr. Casper Wister to study anatomy, because he actually sent back some live animals, and he sent back, samples from some. And he also studied fossils with him. So I don't think Meriwether Lewis was a rugged individual. My God, this guy was the best educated man in all of the United States, I think. Anyway, I just want to show you a quote from him. Now, his trip up, St. Louis, he knew the longitude and latitude of St. Louis. He knew where that was. They went up the Missouri River, here, Fort Mandan. They spent the winter there. He knew where the longitude and latitude of that was. That was where a major fur trading gathering was once a year, with all the natives would come there and trade. It was run by the British. So he knew where that was. And from Captain Gray, he knew exactly where that was. And that's all he knew. He knew nothing else. So he made it all the way up the Missouri, past the falls, and he's right here at the end. And this is before he attempts to cross the mountains, to cross the Continental Divide, and then he's got to find the Columbia River, or a tributary of the Columbia River, so he can find his way to the Pacific. So it's August 18th, 1805, and it's his birthday. So he writes this in his journal. 4 simple little sentences. I'm so impressed with this guy. He writes, "This day I completed my 31st year, and conceived that I had in all human probability now existed about half the period which I am to remain in this sublunary world. I reflected that I had as yet done but little, very little indeed, to further the happiness of the human race, or to advance the information of the succeeding generation. I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence, and now sorely feel the want of that information which those hours would have given me had they been judiciously expended. But since they are past and cannot be recalled, I dash from me the gloomy thought, and resolved in future to redouble my exertions, and at least to endeavor to promote those 2 primary objects of human existence." He means these: to further the happiness of the human race, and to advance the information of succeeding generations. By giving them the aid of that portion of talents which nature and fortune have bestowed on me, or in future to live for mankind as I have heretofore lived for myself. So I just hope that these sandculottes don't try to pull down the statue of Lewis and Clark. So I'm going to end there before everybody falls asleep or leaves. Let me figure out how I get out of here.
Thank you, Jerry.
Minimize. Stop sharing.
Can't hear Scott, but I judge by the flapping of his hands and the clapping that he approves.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Thank you. I know it was long, but I could have talked for 12 days, so I tried to shorten it as much as I could, but there's just so much excitement in that. I hope everyone enjoyed it.